It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Johnny Depp walked into the small diner. The rain had been falling relentlessly for hours, and the streets outside were nearly empty. Inside, the warmth of the diner offered a sharp contrast to the cold world outside. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, but no one seemed to recognize him right away. Johnny didn't want the attention anyway. He preferred to keep a low profile. At the counter, a waitress named Emma was hurriedly refilling coffee cups, trying to keep up with the few customers who had braved the storm. She was in her late 20s, with tired eyes that told a story of exhaustion, physical and emotional. Her brown hair was pulled back into a messy bun, strands falling loose as she moved around the small, cluttered space. She wasn't just tired from working long shifts. There was something deeper in her demeanor, a weight that seemed to press on her every step. Johnny noticed it instantly. He'd seen people like Emma before, people who carried their pain quietly, trying to hide it from the world. He didn't know what her story was, but something in his gut told him it wasn't just the low-paying job that had worn her down. Emma was quick to approach Johnny when he slid into a booth by the window. She gave him a forced smile, but the sadness in her eyes didn't go unnoticed. She placed a menu on the table in front of him, keeping her tone polite but distant. "Can I get you something to drink, sir?" she asked, her voice soft, almost too soft. Johnny looked up at her and smiled gently. "Just a coffee, thanks," he said, his voice calm and easy. There was something comforting about it, as if he was a familiar face even though she had never seen him before. As Emma turned to walk away, Johnny couldn't help but feel a tug at his heart. Something told him that this young woman wasn't just a waitress trying to make ends meet. There was something more to her story. Emma returned a few moments later, the coffee in hand, but her face was still tired, her movements slower than usual. As she set the cup down in front of Johnny, she didn't meet his eyes. It was as though she didn't want him to see her for who she really was, or perhaps she didn't want anyone to look too closely. Johnny didn't rush her. He took his time, letting the quiet stretch between them as he studied her. He could tell she was struggling, but it was more than the exhaustion from long shifts. Something in her posture, slumped shoulders, a weary sigh as she glanced around the empty diner spoke volumes. "Are you okay?" Johnny asked softly, his voice not intrusive but gentle, as if he knew she didn't want to talk but perhaps needed to. Emma paused for a second, her hand hovering near the coffee pot, and for a moment it seemed like she was going to say something, but then she pulled back, the mask of professionalism slipping back into place. "I'm fine, just a lot on my plate, that's all," she said, her words rehearsed, too practiced. Johnny nodded, not pressing her further. He knew better than to push. He'd seen enough people hide their pain to understand when someone needed space. But there was something about Emma, something about the way she tried to keep everything together, that tugged at him. He took a long sip of his coffee and, without thinking, said, "I've been in your shoes before. It's hard, isn't it?" Emma's eyes flickered for just a moment. The faintest tremor in her hand betrayed her, and Johnny caught it, just before she quickly masked it again. "You don't know anything about me," she muttered under her breath, as she turned away to grab a rag and wipe down the counter, her voice low but sharp. Johnny didn't take offense. He understood the defense mechanism. It was clear she didn't want anyone getting too close, and yet, something about her vulnerability made him want to know more. Not for the sake of curiosity, but because he sensed she needed someone to understand, someone who wouldn't just walk away. As he watched her from his seat, his mind drifted back to his own struggles, to the years when life had thrown him more than he could handle, when the loneliness had felt unbearable. He knew what it was like to put on a brave face for the world, even when everything inside was breaking. Maybe Emma wasn't so different after all. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling, as the rain pounded against the windows. Inside the diner, the mood remained quiet, almost too quiet, save for the sound of silverware clinking and the faint hum of the neon sign flickering in the corner. Johnny took another sip of his coffee, his gaze still following Emma as she worked, her every movement heavy with fatigue. The diner wasn't busy, but it seemed like Emma had no time to rest. She moved from one table to the next, her footsteps quick and efficient, but her eyes betrayed her, darting around, always scanning the room, as if she were waiting for something. Johnny couldn't shake the feeling that she was lost in her thoughts, battling something much bigger than the work in front of her. After a while, he decided to break the silence once more. He didn't want to make her uncomfortable, but he couldn't help himself. He leaned forward slightly, his voice warm but firm. "You know, sometimes it helps to talk about it." Emma froze, the rag in her hand going still as her shoulders tensed. For a moment she didn't respond. Then, with a sigh, she dropped the rag on the counter, her back to him as she stared out the window, her reflection faint in the glass. "I've got nothing to talk about," she said, her voice tight, almost resigned. Nothing that would make sense to anyone. Johnny could hear the pain in her words, the weight of her struggle hidden beneath the surface. He wasn't about to press her too hard, but he felt a strong urge to make her see that she didn't have to carry this burden alone. He smiled softly, keeping his voice gentle. "You'd be surprised. Sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference." Emma turned, her eyes meeting his for the first time since he'd sat down. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, uncertainty, vulnerability, and maybe even a hint of relief. But it vanished quickly, replaced by the familiar walls she had built around herself. "You don't know what it's like," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Johnny tilted his head slightly, watching her. There was more to her words than she was letting on. He didn't know what had happened in her past, but it was clear that she had been through something that left deep scars, something that made her think she was all alone in this world. "Maybe not," Johnny replied, his voice soft, understanding. "But I do know that no one is ever truly alone, even when they feel like it." Emma looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, almost as if she were trying to find some kind of truth in his words. Then, after a long pause, she turned away again, her shoulders sagging. "I've got to get back to work," she said quietly, the familiar distance creeping back into her voice. Johnny didn't push her any further. He knew the walls she had put up weren't going to come down easily. But he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere beneath that tough exterior, Emma was waiting for someone to show her kindness, to help her carry the weight of the past, and he was more than willing to be that person, even if she didn't yet realize it. The afternoon stretched on, the rain showing no signs of letting up. The diner had become quieter as the hours passed, the occasional customer slipping in for a quick meal before heading back into the storm. Emma continued to move through the space, but Johnny could see the weight of the day wearing on her. Her movements were slower now, less purposeful, as if every task drained her more than the last. Johnny couldn't help but notice the way her hands trembled slightly as she refilled a cup or wiped down the counter. The subtle signs were impossible to ignore. She was barely holding it together, and Johnny knew that. He had lived through moments of barely hanging on himself. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emma came back to his table, her smile still strained. She had avoided making eye contact for most of the afternoon, but this time when she met his gaze, there was something different about her. A quiet desperation, almost like she was on the edge, wanting to let go but too afraid to do so. Johnny knew the pain she carried wasn't something she'd been able to share with anyone. It was a weight that had probably kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments in her past that had shaped the person she was today. He felt it in the air between them, the silence, the unspoken tension. "How long have you been doing this?" Johnny asked gently, nodding to the diner around them. Emma hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of the coffee cup in front of him. Her eyes flickered toward the kitchen before she finally answered. "A few years. Just trying to get by. You know how it is. Pay the bills, keep a roof over your head, but some days, it feels like it's all I can do just to keep moving." Johnny nodded, recognizing the exhaustion in her voice, but he didn't want to let her get away with just this. He knew there was more to her story, and something in his gut told him it was time to get her to open up. Not for him, but for her. "Doesn't sound like you're really living," he said quietly. "Sounds like you're just surviving." Emma's face stiffened, her eyes momentarily widening at his words. She bit her lip, then quickly turned away, walking to another table before he could say anything more. But Johnny wasn't finished. He watched her for a while, waiting for the right moment. He didn't expect it to come so soon. A few minutes later, Emma was at the counter, her back to him, her hands gripping the edge as she stared out the window. Her shoulders shook, and Johnny could tell something was happening, something was breaking. He stood up, his feet moving before he could think. He didn't know if this was the right thing to do, but he couldn't leave her like this, not when she was so close to falling apart. Emma, he called softly, approaching her. She flinched at the sound of her name, as if she hadn't expected him to be standing there. Slowly she turned, her eyes filled with tears. She was desperately trying to hold back. Johnny felt his heart tighten in his chest. The walls she had built were cracking, and for the first time he saw the raw pain in her eyes. And then, she spoke. "How do you keep going when you feel like you're broken, when you feel like nothing you do will ever make it better?" she asked, her voice breaking as the words escaped. Johnny's heart ached for her. He had never seen someone so vulnerable, so lost. It reminded him of his own struggles, of the times he had felt like he was drowning in his own pain. "Sometimes," he began softly, "you just keep going, even when it feels impossible, and eventually, one day, you wake up and realize that you've come through the other side." He took a slow breath, looking at her. "It doesn't mean the pain goes away, but you learn how to live with it. You learn how to take each day as it comes." Emma shook her head, her tears now flowing freely, her shoulders trembling. "I don't think I can do it anymore." Johnny stepped closer, his hand gently resting on her arm. "You don't have to do it alone," he said, his voice steady. "You've got people who care, you've got me." Emma's eyes widened at the sincerity in his words, the kindness that seemed to shine through him. She had been so used to being on her own, so used to pretending everything was fine, even when it wasn't. But in that moment, standing there with Johnny, something shifted inside her. She didn't have to be alone anymore. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel. And Johnny, seeing her in that raw moment, knew he had just witnessed something life-changing, something that would stay with both of them forever. Thank you for watching. Johnny Depp quietly helps a struggling waitress. Her past leaves him in tears. This story is a powerful reminder that even in our darkest moments, a simple act of kindness can change everything. Johnny's quiet compassion and Emma's struggle to overcome her past show the strength it takes to heal, and the importance of supporting one another through life's toughest times. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like, comment, and share it with your friends. Your support helps us continue sharing more powerful and emotional stories like this one. And don't forget to subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories that are sure to touch your heart. Thank you again for being part of this journey with us. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings in the comments below.